Section 6.3 is on inverse trig functions, and it's very closely related to just inverse functions in general. So let's talk about one-to-one. A one-to-one function means that a function can't have two x values mapped to the same y value. And the horizontal line test goes along with this, and it says a function is one-to-one if no horizontal line intersects its graph more than once. So since the trig functions are not one-to-one, they don't have inverses. So I mean, if you think about the graph of sine and cosine, here's sine, here's cosine, it's basically the same thing, only shifted over. And then tangent would look like this. They're not one-to-one because you can make a horizontal line that intersects each of them in more than one spot. So, I mean, we have inverse trig functions, so how are those a thing? Well, in order to make inverse trig functions, we must restrict the domain. So we're basically only going to take part of the graph. So for sine, we're going to restrict the domain to be negative pi over 2 to pi over 2. So that would make the graph look something like this. And then cosine, we're going to restrict the domain to be 0 to pi. And that would look something like this. And then tangent, we're going to restrict to be negative pi over 2 to pi over 2. And we're not going to include the endpoints because of the asymptote. So now that they are one-to-one, just like with any inverse function, we swap the domain x and the range y to create the inverse functions. And these are the inverse functions. So sometimes they're called sine inverse, cosine inverse, tangent inverse. Sometimes they're called arcsine, arccosine, and arctangent. They really mean the same thing. Here's our domain and ranges. These are the graphs. And each of them is only defined in two quadrants, so one positive and one negative. So sine inverse, again, it was from negative pi over 2 pi over 2. Cosine inverse is 0 to pi. And tangent inverse is negative pi over 2 to pi over 2. And this is very important that the output of an inverse trig function is an angle. So before we had like cosine of pi over 6, and pi over 6 was the input, and we would get something like square root of 3 over 2. Well, now the square root of 3 over 2, that's the input, and we're inputting that into the inverse one, and we get an angle as the output. So that's very important to keep in mind. Okay, so let's look at number 1. It's what's the sine inverse of 1 over 2? So I want to look at the unit circle, and sine, we always do the y value, and this is a positive 1/2. So I don't see any negatives in front of the 1/2. So because this is positive, I want to look in quadrant 1. Because again, we're only looking at two potential quadrants for sine inverse. We're looking at quadrant 1 and quadrant 4. So because this is positive, it's quadrant 1. So where in quadrant 1 do we have a y value of 1/2? Well, it's right here, which is pi over 6. So pi over 6 the angle is our answer.